Hello and welcome everyone to Do Everything 2023. I'm Fiona Maxwell, the Director of Museum Operations and Communications at the Frances Willard House Museum. And each September, the Willard House marks Frances Willard's birthday on September 28th with special programs and tours that reflect on and examine her model of leadership. And so this year is the 150th anniversary of Willard's first term as Dean of Women at Northwestern University. So we are using Do Everything 2023 to explore her contributions to and struggles in the field of women's higher education. And I want to quickly point out that we've actually spent the past program year exploring this topic and related histories, and you can find much more about women's education on our blog, our digital exhibits, and on our YouTube channel. So I encourage you to explore our other resources. And also, I just want to say thank you to all of our supporters and invite that if you would like to continue supporting the production of free public programs like this, please do consider making a donation on our website. All right, so today I will walk you through Willard's first term as Northwestern's Dean of Women in the fall of 1873. Willard broke new ground as a woman professor teaching women and men students in the same classrooms, but she also faced unprecedented challenges to her leadership from within and without. So Frances Willard was herself a product of Evanston's unique educational opportunities for women. She graduated from the Northwestern Female College in 1859, and she described her experience there as highly unusual because she pointed out that during her student days in the 1850s, taking a college course as a woman that was basically equivalent to that offered to young men was, quote, practically unheard of. After she graduated, she worked as a school teacher for 12 years, and in 1871, she was invited to assume charge of her alma mater, which had been renamed the Evanston College for Ladies. So under Willard's leadership, the ECL became the first women's college staffed by an all-female board and faculty. Meanwhile, the neighboring Northwestern University had begun to admit women students in 1869. Willard students took classes and joined literary societies with Northwestern men, and Willard taught both male and female students in her classes. 2 years later, the Evanston College for Ladies had suffered a severe financial setback. Their patrons' pledged funds had literally gone up in smoke during the Great Chicago Fire. After much consideration, the ECL trustees decided to merge with Northwestern. In June 1873, Northwestern hired Willard as their first Dean of Women and made plans to open a new women's college in September. The Articles of Agreement required that Northwestern hire women professors and appoint at least 5 women to the Board of Trustees. The first circular offered young women, quote, equal chances with young men, and assured prospective students that this promise of full educational equality was, quote, not nominal, but real. So this was an unusual move to make in the early 1870s. Coeducation was still relatively new, and so it provoked a lot of comment in the press, especially in the Chicago press. And the overwhelming response in Chicago was positive and excited. And the one paper cut right to the heart of the matter of why this was such a radical move by writing that the admission of women, not only as students, but as professors, officers, and trustees, concedes not only the fitness of women to regulate the education of their own sex, but it is a practical admission also of their ability to exercise concurrent jurisdiction in regard to the education of men. So here it is pointing out that Willard will be teaching men, women will be on the faculty, on the board, they will be regulating men's education, which was, as it later pointed out, unprecedented. And so no other college had done this before. The newspapers predicted that Northwestern would be very influential on other institutions in this way. And they also noted that taking these steps actually made Northwestern the most complete embodiment of the idea of coeducation, and they predicted a successful career for the experiment. So that is what Chicago journalists are opining when this is announced. Male students at Northwestern are also issuing commentaries on this when they start school in the fall, and suddenly there are women in their classrooms. And overwhelming, the press coverage is positive. So they say that coeducation indicates the enterprise of the institution. They say it's a triumph not only for Northwestern, but for the woman movement in its highest and grandest conception. And some of these Northwestern men actually are vocal advocates of women's suffrage. So some of them constitute sort of male allies in the woman movement. They describe finding lady professors and lady students in their recitation rooms and drawing on a 19th century narrative of female moral uplift. They say that having women there is inspiring them to kind of have better manners and to try harder and to form an elevated character. And they claim that coeducation meets the hearty approbation of our most thoughtful young men. Nothing but good comes of this soprano-voiced infusion into our noble educational chorus. And I'll quickly point out there is a qualification that they say the most thoughtful young men. Not all young men will prove quite so thoughtful, but there is a range here. So to understand why these male students are so supportive of coeducation, I think it's important to quickly mention regional identity, because in the 1870s, attitudes towards coeducation were very much divided between the East Coast and the Midwest and West. So on the East Coast, where schools were much more expensive, had a more elite student body, and had been established for decades, if not over a century, there was staunch opposition to coeducation. Whereas in the West and the Midwest, where these were new institutions, they were drawing from a lot of farm students who weren't very wealthy. The institutions didn't have very big endowments. And some of these states were newly settled. They turned to coeducation out of kind of financial and practical necessities, but they also created this discourse of how coeducation is morally superior. It's part of women's rights. And so the Northwestern students wrote this extremely dramatic account of the implementation of coeducation at Northwestern. This is written right at the start of school in fall 1873. So I'll read it to you just to give you a sense of their voices. There was no creaking of rusty hinges, no protracted fumbling of bolts when her doors opened to admit her children, regardless of sex, to equal privileges. At the first knock, her doors were flung wide open, and within was found not a grudging admittance, but a generous welcome. Our young college, with its warm Western blood, accomplished with no unsettling of foundation what the old fogey Eastern colleges seem never able to persuade their slow brains to do. The time will come when those who now regard her with a feeling of superiority, verging on contempt, will envy her record in this. When the resistless spirit of the age shall have forced an entrance to the halls of Yale and Harvard, and turned out of doors their antediluvian notions, they will see that such colleges as this have gained the heights before them, and they have been left far in the rear with the centuries and ideas to which they so persistently clung. The university did not stand on its steeple in consequence, nor did an earthquake occur. The only results were harmony and prosperity. So that is a very idealistic narrative of coeducation at Northwestern that was written somewhat prematurely, right when school started. And as we will see, practice was a little bit different. So we've heard a lot now from young men and from male reporters. Let's hear from some women. So the women students at Northwestern, the first class at the women's college, kept readers apprised of local news from their point of view and made cogent arguments about their educational and political rights. And their main avenue for these writings was Portfolio Fragments, which was their section of the student newspaper. The first edition in the fall of 1873 featured an article on equal rights to intellectual growth, in which the anonymous author situated herself as a member of a talking sisterhood, which refers to the idea that she was unafraid to speak her mind either verbally or in print. And so she used this article to argue that women did not need a delicate feminine course of study. They were fully equipped to take on anything men could learn. And she claimed that women had just as much authority to discuss the education of men as vice versa. So again, defending the women in leadership at the university. So what did this look like in practice? Well, from the student side, to some extent, it was a great success, especially in the realms of literary societies and student governance. So as Dean of Women, Frances Willard observed that immediately after the women gained admittance into previously all-male literary societies, the new members manifested, and I quote, keen and sustained devotion to composition, speech-making, and the study of parliamentary usage. These were all skills that were deemed essential for individuals to train as democratic citizens. So as disenfranchised women, they were gaining the same skills that male politicians needed. So Willard reported that these students hoped to use their evident abilities to, quote, break down the prejudice against women's public speech and work, and to encourage young men to learn that young women are their peers. Northwestern men listened, and they wrote in the newspaper that they vowed that they would give women students equal rights in all of our literary societies. So under this system, women rose to positions of elected leadership immediately in fall of 1873. Some were elected president, not only of their societies, but also of their class government. And right here, I have a photo of Belle Webb, who was rather well known on campus for being a very talented debater, which was very unusual for women at this time because debate was considered one of the most male-dominated speaking genres. But Webb was elected president of the Philomathian Literary Society as well as of her class. So again, we have women student leaders in this first term. And women also would often devote their society productions to discussing their power. So Webb's fellow Philomathian member, Maria Berg, wrote in an essay that she delivered at her society that the most godlike gift of all is the tongue of the eloquent speaker, and that eloquence is the power of working miracles. So you have that same sense of idealism and of women in leadership and claiming authority. So what did the men think of this? Well, they wrote into their newspaper that they thought these mixed gender societies provided a pleasant, friendly meeting for the purpose of exchanging thoughts and ideas and building up a feeling of unity, and it was most desirable, especially at a college designed for the co-education of the sexes. So it seems to be working fairly well on the ground among students. But when it came to women in authority at the kind of administrative and faculty level, there was more pushback. Specifically, there were challenges to Frances Willard's leadership as Dean of Women. So the first came from outside of the university, and it had to do with her method of governing her women students. So when Willard was president of the Evanston College for Ladies for 2 years, she ran that school using a self-government method where the women were following an honor roll system, and they really got to kind of create their own rules in that way. But once the ECL became part of Northwestern, and it was formally a coeducational school, because it was so unprecedented at this time, they didn't quite know how to handle the governance of women. And it was a chaotic first year, and so Willard installed what she described as a temporary measure, just for this year, of the self-report system, which involved handing out these forms to all of her women students every week that outlined 13 rules of the school, and the women had to say yes or no, did they abide by them? And these rules were basically discussing their behavior in and outside of class. Outsiders got a hold of this form, specifically Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a lot of newspaper reporters and editors, and they had a field day. They said it was tyranny, that Willard was a despot. It was, completely antithetical to women's rights. Now, the students actually fired back, and the women claimed that the commiseration for the oppressed ones was not appreciated nor even considered by them as at all called for. And Northwestern students wrote opinion pieces claiming that Willard had proven herself equal to the occasion in responding and handling the scandal. Women's college representatives directly addressed the issue that, yes, there was a double standard for how women and men were governed, but they twisted the logic on its head and said, maybe the problem isn't that women are being held to too high of a behavioral standard. Maybe the problem is the men aren't being held to that same standard. So there was a lot of interesting discussion about this. We actually have another program on our YouTube channel that really dives into the nitty-gritty of this scandal. For the purposes of today, we'll turn our attentions to the resolutions drafted by We the Oppressed, namely Willard's female students. And they made a point of italicizing in these resolutions that they were drafted of our own free will, and they used this document to claim that they believed that the rules were salutary, they were happy to adopt them. They described Willard as an efficient teacher, a kind, faithful friend, one who, forgetful of self, is unwearied in her efforts to promote our intellectual and moral interests. And they sent copies of these to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to the student newspaper, the Evanston newspaper, the Chicago newspapers, anyone who criticized Willard, and they affectionately sent a copy to Willard herself. So at the same time that Willard was being attacked in the press, she was also being attacked by her own students in the recitation room. So Willard recalled that it was an entirely new thing for male students to recite to women faculty. And she said that the male students tested the female faculty in various ways. One day, when she entered her mixed-gender rhetoric class, she saw a sentence written on the blackboard that read, "Miss Willard runs the freshmen like a pack of girls." Willard's strategy was to completely ignore it, and she just erased it nonchalantly while she carried on with the class exercises. The next time, the young men trapped a cat in her desk drawer, and it howled for the entire recitation hour. But again, she ignored it, pretended not to hear it. Then the third incident was that a dozen young men out of a class of about 75 students went one by one in and out of the door to the lecture hall, making sure to creak it as loud as possible to try to distract Willard and disrupt the lesson. Willard again ignored it and went on with the class. Now, she did actually have male allies, so that night she had a young man, a student who was boarding with her at Rest Cottage, her home, and he actually volunteered. He took soap to the recitation room, and he lathered up the door hinges so that then the next day, the troublemakers were shocked to find that the door swung to and fro as if on velvet instead of iron. And just as a little point, if you remember back when the students said that there was no creaking of rusty hinges in letting women into Northwestern, there was quite a bit of creaking of rusty hinges against Willard and women. So reporters for the Chicago Tribune, always eager to unearth a scandal, went a bit further in the accusations that they levied against the young men, even beyond what Willard reported. So they claimed that the young men drew an indecent and obscene blackboard caricature, that women students had been made uncomfortable by rude conduct and ribald songs. Northwestern young men leapt to their own defense and said that such instances are exceedingly rare. They said there were perhaps a few boys who were not conducting themselves with strict propriety, but as a body, the young men compared favorably in courtesy and refinement with a similar number in any college of the land. And again, kind of claiming their Midwestern superiority, they claimed that most of the barbarous practices, such as rushing, hazing, etc., quite customary in many Eastern colleges, have among us scarcely had an existence. Not yet, at least. So, to conclude, I think what we can learn from the first term of Willard's tenure as Dean of Women at Northwestern is that there was a little bit of a gap between rhetoric and reality. So while everyone was very excited to announce this new experiment, on the ground, there were triumphs and there were troubles, and some students were not quite willing to accept being governed by a woman faculty member and dean. In fact, Willard ended up leaving Northwestern at the end of this academic year, in the spring of 1874, after a clash with the president of the university. And she then joined the newly founded Women's Christian Temperance Union. So as she transitioned from education to social reform, she nevertheless maintained the idea that she was helping women in their development. She described the WCTU as WCT University because she was helping women learn skills like public speaking, running meetings, dealing with legislation, all of these political skills that they did not have the chance to otherwise learn. Meanwhile, back at Northwestern, later generations of women students continued to track Willard's career, and they really viewed her as a role model as they advocated for their own equality on campus. So I think we will leave our story here for now, and we will pick it up in the coming months. As we reach December, we will be marking the anniversary of the Women's Temperance Crusades and the formation of the WCTU. So we'll be following Willard as she slowly removes herself from higher education and goes into social reform. But with that, I will say happy Do Everything 2023. Thank you.